All right, OCO everyone, welcome to our June Lunch and Learn history presentation. I'm really excited for our next presenter today. A little bit before I introduce Art, I met him about 20 years ago when I was a park ranger at Fort Smith, over at the Fort Smith National Historic Site. And everyone knows that I love to talk about outlaws and lawmen of the Cherokee Nation and Indian Territory, and it was his book that really turned me on to this. So if you don't have this book, Black, Red, and Deadly, I really encourage it if you're interested in learning more about the Black and Indian outlaws in Cherokee Nation, Indian Territory. Again, this is really what turned me on to learning about outlaws and lawmen in the Cherokee Nation. So Art Burton received a bachelor's and master's in African American Studies from Governor State University. He retired in 2015 after spending 38 years in higher education. He was a history professor at Prairie State College and South Suburban College and worked as an administrator in African American Student Affairs at Benedictine University, Loyola University in Chicago, and Columbia College in Chicago. In 1991, Burton wrote the first book on African American and Native American outlaw and lawmen in the Wild West. It is titled Black, Red, and Deadly, Black and Indian Gunfighters of the Indian Territory, 1870 to 1907. In 1999, Burton wrote the first book on African Americans who were scouts and soldiers in the Wild West. The book is titled Black, Buckskin, and Blue, African American Scouts and Soldiers on the Western Frontier. In 2007, Burton wrote the first scholarly biography on an African American lawman of the Wild West. This work is titled Black Gun, Silver Star, The Life and Legend of Frontier Marshal Bass Reeves. His most recent work, Cherokee Bill, Black Cowboy, Indian Outlaw, is also out now. Burton has appeared in 4 documentaries for the History Channel on cable television. He was a participant on BET's Teen Summit with Mario Van Peebles for discussion on the movie Posse. In 2015, Burton appeared on Fox Cable's Legends and Lies series episode titled The Real Lone Ranger and was a participant in the AHC cable series Gunslingers episode on Bass Reeves. Burton spoke at the B.B. King Symposium at Mississippi Valley State University in the fall of 2018 on African American and Native American cultures. In 2019, Burton was the keynote speaker at the 10th anniversary Bass Reeves Western History Conference in Muskogee, Oklahoma. He was recently named the historian for the National Multicultural Western Heritage Museum of Fort Worth, Texas. Art is passionate about the Wild West and continues to bring unsung heroes to light. Everyone, please welcome author and historian Art Burton.
OCO. Sure, I learned a little something, right? Catherine took me and my wife around yesterday. I seen a lot of things in the Cherokee Nation I had never seen before, and so that was very educational, and I really appreciate that. It's been good. I've had a chance to speak at the Cherokee Conference at the Hard Rock Casino, and that was great, and met a lot of wonderful people. And so this is a continuation of my participation with the Cherokee Nation, which is wonderful. And actually, I've been speaking, for the past 30 years. This is the first time I actually have spoken to a gathering of any Native American tribe in the United States. So this is a first for me this weekend. So it's been really good. Now, one of the things, my mother's from Oklahoma, and my grandparents came here during the Oklahoma territorial days, and I grew up watching Westerns on television in the 50s and 60s. And I grew up thinking that black folks really had no participation in the Wild West because I didn't see it on television in the movies. And then the only thing I seen with Native Americans was them fighting Custer or some John Wayne movie where they were getting slaughtered and killed. And so I had very little knowledge base of Native American history as it pertained to the Wild West. Oklahoma was the Wild West. This was really where the battle between law and outlaw played out more so than anywhere in frontier America. We can look at places like Deadwood and Dodge City and Tombstone and El Paso, just pretty much any place you name in the country, and they had little short runs where they had some battles between outlaw and lawmen, but frontier Oklahoma was where it played out for about 50 years. And the greatest lawmen in the Wild West were from Frontier, Oklahoma, and the greatest outlaws were from Frontier, Oklahoma. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. And I've been really just amazed by the information that I've been able to find and research. And my first book, as Catherine was saying, Black, Red, and Deadly Black and Indian Gunfighters of the Indian Territory, 1870-1907, was the first book of its kind ever published, and is still the only book of its kind that is sold in the United States of America. And most of that is Oklahoma. And I'm just happy to get that information out. Some people have used it for their studies within colleges and in high schools around the country, so I'm really happy about that also. But anyway, we're located where we are right now in Tahlequah is a very important place in that history, because this is where the whole saga with Ned Christie started. And on this board, I have a picture, two pictures of Ned on the top row here. That's a picture of him, and that's a picture of him holding his pistol and rifle. Ned was not an outlaw, although he was classified as an outlaw. He was not an outlaw. They had an incident here in Tahlequah where a deputy U.S. Marshal named Maples came over from the Fort Smith federal court to arrest people who were selling bootleg whiskey. Whiskey was the biggest crime in the Indian Territory for the deputy U.S. Marshals out of Fort Smith, Arkansas. And what happened was that they were having a meeting here in Tahlequah about the female seminary that had been burnt. And so there was a lot of leaders of the Cherokee Nation meeting trying to figure out what direction they were going to go in. And that evening that the meeting took place, a lot of people, I guess, decided they wanted to imbibe a little bit. And Ned Christie was on the Cherokee Council, and he liked to drink. And there was a black lady, Cherokee freedwoman, who was known to sell whiskey here in town illegally. And he got some whiskey and got drunk. Well, Dan Maples was going around town trying to find out where these people getting the whiskey from. And he was shot and killed by a person we know now as Bud Traynor. Bud and his buddies claimed that Ned had done the crime. They were all interviewed, and they said, no, Ned Christie did the crime. And Ned had no clue about it because he had been drunk. Ned's friends told him that if you go to Fort Smith, because they wanted to talk to Ned, that he would not get bail. And Ned wanted to be able to defend himself before trial even took place, to tell him what had happened. And so his friends told him, don't go to Fort Smith. So Ned didn't go to Fort Smith to try to talk to the fellow authorities. And they put a warrant out on his life. And that was the beginning of what became known as the Ned Christie War, because it went on for 5 years. And there was many incursions of deputy U.S. Marshals coming over to where Ned lived, not too far from here. And Ned pretty much held them off. He was known for nicking some of them from time to time. The first named deputy U.S. Marshal that came over with a posse was Heck Thomas. And Heck wounded Ned, but he wasn't able to capture Ned. I think Ned was able to shoot some of the people in the posse. And then in November of 1890, Bass Reeves, the famous black deputy U.S. Marshal, brought a posse over. And they surrounded Ned's cabin and burned it down. And they thought Ned was in the cabin, but he wasn't. Ned and his wife was watching while the whole thing went down. And Ned's wife prevented him from shooting Bass, because he wanted to shoot Bass Reeves during this whole episode. So that happened. And then later on, some more deputies came through later, and around 91, and Ned wounded 2 or 3 of them. And then finally, in 1892, they brought a large posse over, around 18 people in the posse, and they got a cannon from Fort Scott, Kansas, and they had a lot of dynamite, and they surrounded Ned's cabin, and they fired at the cabin with the cannon, and the cannon was just bouncing. The balls were bouncing off the cabin, with no effect whatsoever. And they decided to get a wagon and load it with the dynamite and push it up to the cabin. And besides blowing part of the cabin up, they started the cabin on fire. And Ned tried to escape the cabin, and he was killed by one of the people in the posse. After they killed Ned, they brought his body to Fort Smith and placed it on the door of the cabin, and they took pictures with the body. But that was the end of Ned Christie's war for the most part. And then later on, many years later, around 1918, there was a black man who witnessed the murder of Deputy Marshal Maples, and he stated that Bud Traynor had been the person who had committed the crime. So the whole episode of Ned Christie's war was sadly something that shouldn't have never took place, and it did take place. One of the things that happened in the Cherokee Nation was the Bill Cook gang. And Cherokee Bill, the person I wrote about the last little biography on Cherokee Bill, he was a member of the Bill Cook gang, and they turned the Creek Nation and the Cherokee Nation upside down in 1894, robbed trains, banks, and stagecoaches. This is a picture of Jim French, who was a right-hand man of Bill Cook. This is a picture of Bill Cook. Here's Cherokee Bill. They had a good run for about a year before the authorities put a lot of pressure on them. One of the most interesting things I found was that the New York Times newspaper had a running commentary on this gang. They were getting national recognition. Cherokee Bill, who was the worst of the group, was quite an interesting fella. He had grown up in Fort Gibson, which is right outside of Muskogee, and his father had been a member of the United States Army. Father and his mother had separated while he was very young, and he was with his father for a while, and then he left his father and was pretty much on his own as a teenager. He worked as a cowboy for a while, and after he did that, he was at a dance in Fort Gibson, and his brother was being picked on. He tried to help his brother out. He got beat up real bad. So the next morning, the guy that beat his brother up, Cherokee Bill, took a pistol and shot him 2 or 3 times and thought he had killed him, but he hadn't. But he went on the run then, and he was wanted by the Cherokee Nation because both of them were citizens. The person he shot, and he himself was a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, so that was not a federal offense. And so he hooked up with the Cook brothers, and the Cook brothers had been cowboys themselves. Now, a lot of outlaws had never worked as cowboys, but a lot of these young men in this area did work as cowboys, and so they had done that work, and I guess they felt the money wasn't to their taste and they'd get more money. So they decided to hold up trains and banks and stagecoaches and did it on a fairly regular basis. Cherokee Bill was about 6 foot tall, and he was very good with a Winchester rifle. Actually, in July of 1894, they went to Chandler, Oklahoma, was Oklahoma Territory, and they robbed the Lincoln County Bank. And part of the gang came in from the back, some came in from the front. And it was the barber down the street, say like 300 yards away, and he started hollering, "The Daltons are in town." And Cherokee Bill took his rifle and shot him at about 300 yards and killed him. They didn't get much money at that bank robbery, but there was a big gunfight outside of Chandler when they were headed back going east to the Creek Nation. And I think they said something like 600 gunshots were exchanged. One of the outlaws was captured, but Cherokee Bill and the Cook brothers got away from that particular incident. And so that whole 1894 was very hot here in Indian Territory. The gang broke up, and Bill Cook took part of the gang to New Mexico, and they got captured by authorities. And Cherokee Bill took a part of the gang, and his gang committed more trepidations. And as I was telling folks the other day, on 2 occasions I know that Cherokee Bill went to towns, small towns, and it got so bad that after he killed a gentleman in Lenapaw, which is in the Cherokee Nation, the city council of Lenapaw passed a resolution that if Cherokee Bill come to town, give him free way and let him have anything he want to get him out of town as soon as he can. And I never seen where a town that passed a resolution giving an outlaw free pass whenever they came to town. But they did so. But Cherokee Bill was eventually captured by a former deputy U.S. Marshal named Ike Rogers, who was a Cherokee freedman, had been a deputy U.S. Marshal. And they were playing cards one night, and because the thought was that Ike Rogers would have Cherokee Bill over to his house, and he could capture him and get his $1,300 reward money, and he'd get a commission again as a deputy U.S. Marshal. And I guess Ike thought that was a good deal, and so they did that, and they were playing cards, and Ike was looking to capture and get Bill, and Bill wouldn't go to sleep because Ike was giving him, whiskey all night so he can go to sleep, and Cherokee Bill stayed woke. And so the next morning, Cherokee Bill leaned over to light his cigarette, they said, in the fireplace, and Ike Rogers hit him over the head with a piece of stick, and said they wrestled for about 30 minutes on the ground, and Ike had a buddy with him named Clint Scales, and there were two men trying to wrestle Cherokee Bill, but they finally got the handcuffs on him, and they put him in the wagon, and they said Cherokee broke the handcuffs with his bare strength, and they threatened to kill him with a shotgun, and Cherokee Bill said, okay, I'll go. They arrested him, and Bill was then taken to Fort Smith. There was a lot of fanfare along the way. There was some picture taken at some of the train stations. And when they got him to Fort Smith, Cherokee Bill, people were so curious to see him, he put a sheet over his cell where he was and had people pay a dime to see him. He would lift it up and put the dime under the thing. And then somebody eventually sent a gun somehow into the jail for Cherokee Bill, and he tried to escape. He killed one of the guards, and it was unsuccessful. And he was executed in March of 1896 by Judge Isaac C. Parker's court. He was 20 years old. But Cherokee Bill was everything Hollywood tried to make Billy the Kid up to be, because he's a fairly good-looking guy. He had a lot of girlfriends, and he stuck up trains, banks, and stagecoaches, something Billy the Kid never did. He wore Jingle Bob spurs, the little bells on the spurs. He wore studded chaps with metal studs on them, just very colorful. He wore a big white hat with a red brim thing on it, very colorful. He used to like to have shootouts with the lawmen. He wasn't scared of having shootouts with the law. But anyway, Cherokee Bill was quite an outlaw, and was considered the number one outlaw in the history of the Indian Territory ever. Judge Parker said he was the worst outlaw ever came before his court. The next person I'd like to talk about is Henry Starr, who was a Cherokee. And Henry Starr knew Cherokee Bill. They were friends. And some people say that Henry Starr rode with the Cook gang at one point in time. He was getting picked up for crimes he said he didn't commit, so he said, I might as well commit some crimes. So he started stealing horses and selling bootleg whiskey, and that wasn't giving him enough money, I guess, and so he decided that he would start robbing banks. And the main bank robbers we hear about is Jesse James, the Dalton, the Doolin gangs. They paled in comparison. During one period of Henry Starr's life, for a year and a half, he stuck up 14 banks. And then at the end of his career, it was noted that he stuck up 22 banks altogether. In today's money, he made about $2.5 million in today's money. And he did get killed in his last bank robbery. It was in 1922 in Benton, Arkansas. And he was using an automobile, because all his bank robberies previous was on horseback. But the last one he did was by automobile. But Henry Starr, he actually too, when he came out of prison, he went to prison about 2 or 3 times. And one of the last times he came out of prison, I think around 1918 or so, he made a movie about his career. And nobody has any part of the movie today, the reels, but he was very proud of the fact that he was such a great bank robber. Nobody ever got hurt doing any of his bank robberies, although he had killed a deputy U.S. Marshal earlier in his career, but that wasn't doing a crime. But Henry Starr was the greatest bank robber in the history of the Wild West, and he was from Fort Gibson also. That's where he grew up, which is not too far from here. So he was a Cherokee outlaw. So these are people that you never seen movies made about, right? Cherokee Bill or Henry Starr. So they were quite active. Now I'm gonna talk a little bit about the lawmen, because I know our time is getting short a little bit. Over here, I have Sam Six Killer. And Sam was stationed here in Tahlequah. He was the high sheriff of the district, and he was also over the prison. The Cherokees had the only prison in the Indian nations. The Indians, the 5 tribes, as they were called, had their own police, had their own judges, they had their own courts. But the Cherokees had their prison, and they did execute people here in Tahlequah who were citizens of the Cherokee Nation who committed crimes. The other tribes, 4 tribes, had what was known as the light horse police. The Cherokees started the whole aspect of light horse police, but after the Civil War, they just had high sheriffs, or they were called the Cherokee police as such. And they worked very closely with the deputy U.S. Marshals out of Fort Smith. And actually, after Sam was a high sheriff in the Tahlequah district, he became a deputy United States Marshal for the Fort Smith Court. And then in 1880, the agent for the 5 tribes, which was headquartered in Muskogee, started the United States Indian Police. Very, very unique organization. Didn't exist anywhere else in the United States, anything like it. The United States Indian Police had jurisdiction over all the 5 tribes, and they worked for the Indian agent. And the leaders of the United States Indian Police, the captains, would be given status as deputy U.S. Marshals. And so Sam Six Killer was the first. He made numerous arrests throughout the Indian Territory, captured a lot of bad folks. The most famous outlaw that he captured was a black outlaw. His name was Dick Glass. And Dick Glass had a gang of 11 men with him. I believe he had 6 blacks, 3 Indians, and 2 whites. But he had a lot of shootouts with the law. Actually, there was some lawmen came up from Texas, and they thought they had shot Dick Glass. He fell off his horse onto the ground. They rode up to Dick Glass, and Dick shot them both dead. That was down in the Chickasaw Nation. But Sam Six Killer was able to capture Dick Glass. Dick was coming back into the Indian Territory with a load of whiskey out of Texas with 2 or 3 Confederates with him. And what they would do, they would rob or steal horses in the Indian Territory and take the horses to Texas and trade it in for bootleg whiskey. And so they were tired of Dick Glass, and so Sam Six Killer was able to capture, or basically I think they killed all of them, but he was the one who shot Dick Glass and brought his reign to an end. Sadly, Sam Six Killer was killed on the streets of Muskogee in 1886. Right before Christmas, he was with his kids, and some of the outlaws who didn't like him surprised him and shot him dead on the streets of Muskogee. Muskogee was probably the wildest town in the Wild West during that period. It has been totally overlooked. I just recently wrote an article for True West magazine on Muskogee, and the editors of the magazine stated that Muskogee was the wildest town in the Indian Territory. I mean, they skirt around that because they, glorified Tombstone and Deadwood and Dodge City as such, but no comparison to Muskogee, Oklahoma. So when Sam was killed, he was also given status by the U.S. government, because after that, the U.S. government said that the killing of a Native American law enforcement officer was a federal offense. And so they made it a federal offense for a Native American law enforcement officer to be killed in the line of duty. Also up here, I have another gentleman that I'm very fond of. His name is Zeke Paris, and that's Zeke Paris there. Zeke Paris was stationed here in Tahlequah. I think he was born and raised here in Tahlequah. He's a good-looking guy, and he was known to be an outstanding law enforcement officer. He started as the high sheriff here in the Tahlequah district. He was a city marshal, actually, in Tahlequah from 1887 to 1889, and he served as a deputy state marshal for 19 years for the Fort Smith Court. And he was also the executioner here in Tahlequah for the Cherokee Nation's prison. And of the 14 prisoners that were executed, he executed 11 of them. And so he was the executioner here in Tahlequah. There was one Indian, I believe his name was Belle, who had killed 11 people. And Zeke Paris got on his trail, and he followed him for 31 days and was able to capture him after a 31-day hunt. And Belle was brought back here to Tahlequah and was found guilty, and Zeke was the person that executed him on the gallows here in Tahlequah. Another person that is probably one of the greatest law enforcement officers in the Indian Territory, and this gentleman right here, and this is him here. He was the 4th captain of the United States Indian Police, and his name was Jackson Ellis. Jackson Ellis, and some people just called him Jack Ellis. He was 6'4", pretty tall. If you look at this picture, you could tell he's a tall guy. But he was very learned. He was a lawyer, and previous to being into law enforcement, he did have his own store. And he arrested just a large number of criminals here in the Indian Territory, and should be remembered for what he did. Very outstanding police officer during that time period. And he held it up almost to Oklahoma statehood as captain of the United States Indian Police. And this picture would have been from Muskogee. This picture here with the officers at Muskogee at the United States Indian Police headquarters. Jackson Ellis also was the person who killed Dick Van, who shot Sam Sixkiller. So he was able to pursue and kill the person who had killed Sam Sixkiller later on in life. Part and parcel of many of these people. Also, I do have John C. West, his brother Frank West. Frank was killed in a gunfight with Sam Starr, and he killed Sam at the same time that he got killed. And another person over here is a person we want to remember, and that is Zeke Proctor. And Zeke was involved with the largest gunfight in the history of the Wild West. Again, here in the Cherokee Nation. People always talk about the gunfight at the OK Corral. Gunfight at OK Corral was nothing compared to the gunfight at the Going Snake Schoolhouse. I think they probably had 3 people got killed at the OK Corral. At the gunfight at the Going Snake Schoolhouse, we had 11 people got killed. And then we had about 3 or 4 got wounded. And it all came about because Zeke had accidentally killed a woman while he was trying to kill the man who had been formerly married to his sister. Caught him at a meal, and they had a fight, and Zeke accidentally killed the woman that Kesterson was Polly Beck. The Kesterson went to Fort Smith, Arkansas, although because he had been married to Zeke's sister, he was a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and he kind of said he didn't want to be a Cherokee citizen anymore. He wanted to be a citizen of the United States. He wanted to supersede that, and so he had them get a posse together, and the federal government agreed to come over and see what was happening with the trial that was taking place in the Going Snake District, because Zeke had turned himself in. And when they came to the location of the schoolhouse, one of the Beck family members charged in and shot. He was trying to kill Zeke, but he shot Zeke's brother, and the gunfight was on. And it took place inside and outside the schoolhouse. And with all the deaths that did take place, the deputy marshal in charge was killed, and the news of the gunfight went all the way to Washington, D.C. And President Grant recognized that the Cherokee Nation had put warrants out on the federal authorities, and the federal government had put warrants out on the Cherokee that had been involved. And so President Grant, along with other congressmen and federal officials in D.C., wanted to have an ending of this whole thing that happened, and so they passed a measure where nobody would be charged with any of the murders, and that's how it wound up. So went all the way to the President of the United States. Zeke later became a sheriff in the Cherokee Nation in the district in which he lived, and he also became a deputy U.S. Marshal for the Fort Smith Court. But in terms of legendary figures, he's one of the most legendary figures in the Cherokee Nation history. So that's some of the Cherokee lawmen that were outstanding during the frontier era. Now, the person that got me hooked into the whole history of the Indian Territory and looking at this whole shebang was a guy on front of here, Bass Reeves. I got into this kind of by happenstance. I was watching a Wyatt Earp movie, 11 years old, at my grandparents' home. And I asked my grandparents were there any black lawmen on the frontier days. And my grandfather remembered, and he couldn't think of the name. And then he asked my grandmother, who was that black man over in Muskogee? And she couldn't remember right away. And then she said, oh, Bass Reeves. And I guess that was planted somewhere in the back of my head because I forgot about it completely, that particular conversation, until many years later. After I got married, me and my wife used to go to rodeos in Chicago. We used to have black rodeos, and it ran a whole week. And so we went to this rodeo, and they would have a skit. And the skit had a stagecoach being robbed, and a black man came out with a badge, huge badge, because I could see it way up in the rafters. And he saved the day and rescued the people being robbed in the stagecoach. And so I went to a family reunion one time, and my cousin was with his roommate, his former roommate, who was from Muskogee, and his roommate said he was from Reeves Edition in Muskogee, and it was named for Bass Reeves. And I've been writing a column for about 10 years or so at that time, and I thought, well, I could write an article about this man, because I never heard of a part of a town named for a lawman, black or white or whatsoever. And so I told my relatives to get all the information they could find on folks who remember Bass Reeves, and I contacted the Northeastern State University here at Tahlequah about Muskogee, because this was the closest state university to Muskogee, and they said they would check it out. So then they sent me a packet from Northeastern State University on Reeves Edition, and I found out it was named for a banker named Era Reeves, who was a white man. But I guess black people was living in Reeves Edition, and they just were thinking that it was named for Bass Reeves because this was the last place he lived. And so I was about ready to give up the ghost on that, and then I remember there was a black man out of Evanston who started a black museum in Denver, Colorado. It was in the basement of a black radio station at that time. And his name was Mr. Stewart. So I called him up on the phone. I said, were there any black lawmen of note in the Wild West? And he first thing out of his mouth was Bass Reeves. And I was kind of shocked. And I said, well, what do you know about him? He said, I don't know anything about him, but he says a couple of older black men from Oklahoma. He said, that's all they talk about. And he says, one, Reverend Haskell Shubu, said that Bass would walk the streets of Muskogee with a sidekick who carried a satchel full of pistols. So I called up the operator on the phone in Denver and told her I wanted to see if there's a listing for a Haskell Shubu, and she said there was. I called the number she gave me. A lady answered. I told her I wanted to speak to Reverend Haskell Shubu. She said, just a minute. And Reverend Shubu got on the phone, and he didn't talk very loud. He was very hard to hear. And I told him I wanted to find out about Bass Reeves, and he laughed. And he went on to say that Bass could outride, outshoot, outfight, outrope, out blah, blah, blah. It was some of the stuff I'd heard from these other older people I had talked to earlier. Then he said, I'll tell you something I seen my own eyes. I'll tell you something I seen my own eyes. He told me he drove the hack for Bud Ledbetter, who was one of the top lawmen in Muskogee after the turn of the century. And he said Bud Ledbetter had a posse at Gibson Station. He said that the posse was after an outlaw, and they couldn't hit the outlaw, and they was using a lot of ammunition, and that was his inventory. And Ledbetter was getting upset. So he told somebody in Muskogee to go back, in the posse, to go back to Muskogee and get Bass Reeves. So he said that the Bass came on the scene later in the day. The sun was starting to go down. The posse had quit shooting at the man because I guess he wasn't making no headway. And so he said they quit shooting at him, and it was pretty much at a standstill. He said the outlaw jumped up. And when he said the outlaw jumped up, I watched so many Hollywood movies, I figured you're going to jump up and get on his horse, right? Make a break for it. And so he said, man started running across this field and said the posse started shooting at the man. And they were missing. And he said, Bud Ledbetter hollered at the top of his voice, "Get him, Bass." And he said, Bass Reeves said, coolly and calmly, "I will break his neck." And he said Bass took his Winchester rifle and broke this man's neck at a quarter of a mile. So when he told me that story, I thanked him for it. I was mad as hell, though, because I said, that's the biggest lie I ever heard in my life. Chubu told me he was 98 years old. And generally people tell you a lie, they won't get something out of the lie, or they told you a good lie. I said, this man has got 1 foot in the grave, right? A lie is not going to get him anything. And I'm thinking, this could be true. But I said, it don't make sense. I never seen nothing like that in a movie. It don't make sense. And so by the end of the week, I became possessed at finding everything I could and everything I could find on Bass Reeves. And that started the whole journey of doing research on Bass Reeves. And I found a paper at the University of Oklahoma's library called The Forgotten Lawmen, written by a gentleman named Richard Fronterhouse, who was a white student in the 1950s. And he had heard about a black lawman in Oklahoma. He didn't know who he was, but he went around the state in 1957, took a 100-pound reel-to-reel tape recorder and interviewed 27 people, including Bass's daughter. And he found some cowboys who witnessed Bass Reeves in a gunfight, kill an outlaw at a quarter of a mile in a gunfight. So I knew I wouldn't find the shoe boot story, but here was another gunfight where Bass had shot somebody at a quarter of a mile. The information I found on Bass Reeves was like a comic book type of thing, and I just be in the archive shaking my head. I said, nobody gonna believe this. Nobody gonna believe this. And it went on, and I had a friend, Robert Ernst, who was in the archives when I was in the Oklahoma Historical Archives. And I told Robert, I said, Robert, nobody's gonna believe this. And Robert said, well, if you don't write it, who's gonna write it? And I said, well, I guess he's got something there. And so his whole story became the crux of my first book, which Bass is the largest chapter in the book. But I found other blacks who were outlaws, blacks who were lawmen, Native Americans who were outlaws, and Native Americans who were, and so that was the book, Black, Red, and Deadly. And that was the book that got Bass's name out there. So that was the first book that talked about Bass. And then after I finished that book, I ran into so many people who said, well, you need to just do a book on Bass Reeves. And Bass was illiterate. He couldn't read or write. So he left no memoirs. And so I had to go back and go to the National Archives. I went to Washington, D.C. I went to Fort Worth, Texas, which is the southwest branch of the National Archives. I did another intrinsic newspaper search. I talked to anybody and everybody I could who had family stories about Bass Reeves. And so that was the impetus then for Black Gun Silver Star, the life and legend of the frontier marshal Bass Reeves. That book came out in 2006. It was updated with an added information in September 22. And I don't think you're going to find too much more information on Bass Reeves. He was 6'2", about 190 pounds. He could shoot with left hand, right hand, you name it. He could whip any two men with his bare hands. He worked in disguise on a regular basis to capture criminals. In 1902, he was interviewed by a newspaper. He stated he had arrested over 3,000 people in 1902. That was still 5 years before he retired as deputy as marshal. The newspaper said he killed 14 people. Then when he died, there were some newspapers saying he killed over 20 people. He was not proud of killing folks, but he was proud of his detective skills. And I was contacted about a year ago from Houston, Texas, and a police officer down there said he loved my book on Bass Reeves, but he didn't see the Houston story. And I started scratching my head. I said, the Houston story? And I knew that Bass, when he worked for the Paris, Texas court, which had jurisdiction over the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations, the Houston court, also, the Paris court covered everything in East Texas all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. So he sent me some newspaper articles which showed that in 1896, there was a murder in Houston, Texas. They sent Bass Reeves to Houston, Texas. He went in as Jim Underwood, a criminal. They threw him into jail with the guy who they thought had committed the crime. Bass stayed with the man all through the summer of 1896. They traveled through Texas to various cities. They came to an Indian territory, and they also went to Shreveport, Louisiana. And Bass got the confession, and they were able to convict the man who had killed gentleman who owned a rooming house in Houston, Texas. But I had never known Bass had went that deep into Texas doing law enforcement work at all, because basically I just knew about the Indian Territory work. Bass Reeves is the greatest lawman in the history of the United States of America. He's probably, without about, the greatest gunfighter in the history of the Wild West. I don't think you can not compare Bass to anybody. You can name Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, anybody you want to name, to Bass Reeves. Bass did it for 32 years. He walked in the Valley of Death for 32 years. The Indian Territory is the most dangerous place in the Wild West for deputies marshals. If you take a 50-mile radius of Muskogee, that's where the majority of the deputies were killed. Somewhere over 130 were killed in the Indian Oklahoma territories. But the majority were killed within that 50-mile radius of Muskogee, and the majority of them was killed in the Cherokee Nation, where we are right now. So this was really the battleground of law and outlaw in the Wild West, because this is the Wild West. This is where it really took place. And the outlaws that I talked a little bit about, Bass Reeves, what he did, and he worked a lot here in the Cherokee Nation throughout his career, especially from 75 to 93, and then when he worked out in the Muskogee court from 97 up to statehood in 1907, they sent him into the Cherokee Nation on a quite regular basis. There was a place at Bragg's, had a race ride. Bass and his buddy, he had a white buddy named Adams that worked for him when he was in Muskogee. And so they brought in 27 people who had been involved in that race ride in Bragg's at that time. Outstanding lawman, and I'm very glad I could bring the story to the American public and people could understand what had happened. And he's a hero. America's great. Me and my wife, we drove into Oklahoma, and I was happy to see Bass's picture on the Oklahoma Highway map. So it's a lot of times I forget things. I didn't talk about the Lone Ranger analogy. We can do that if you want, but I can stop now and take questions from anybody who'd like to ask me any type of questions. Yeah, I'm trying to put together a book on Muskogee. Since Muskogee was the wildest town in the Wild West, it definitely needs a book to talk about that, right? So I've come across lawmen and outlaws and incidents that happened in the Muskogee area, and I'm gonna try to put together a book on Muskogee so people know the real Muskogee, so they can understand how this town makes those other towns pale in comparison. Thank you. Right, yeah, Belle was married to Sam Starr, who was a citizen of the nation, and that may give her citizenship. When I first talked to those old people that my cousins gave me phone numbers to, there was a gentleman in Oklahoma City named Simmons, and Simmons had grown up in the Creek Nation. And Mr. Simmons, who at that time was in his 90s, I believe, he told me, he said, Bass was sweet on Belle Starr. And I didn't know what he was talking about. So at first I didn't do too much with that. Then there was writings from a gentleman from Potawatomi County, and he wrote about the fact that his father was one of the first doctors in the Indian Territory, and his father used to service Belle Starr if she had medical needs. And he said he was at Belle's house one time, and Bass rolled up. And Belle stated that that was one of her very good friends, Bass Reeves, and she was very admiring of Bass's quality as a man, as a lawman, and what he stood for. And so I put that in my book, Black, Red, and Deadly. And then later on, I found out that she did a year in jail at the Detroit House of Corrections for horse theft. Then later on, after she got out, they put another warrant on her for horse theft. And the warrant, the second time, it was 1885, that warrant went to Bass Reeves. Now, Bass had a regular thing where if he knew people, he would tell them, I have a warrant for your arrest. Why don't you go see what it's about so I don't have to drag you around in my prison wagon for a month or so. The only time that Belle Starr turned herself in at Fort Smith, Arkansas, for a crime she was accused of was the time that Bass Reeves had the warrant for her arrest. Using deductive reasoning, then I would say that Bass probably let Belle know that he had the warrant for her arrest. Why don't she go see what it's about? And she was able to prove that she hadn't stolen the horse that she was being accused of, and so she never went to prison for that particular charge. But that was the only time that Belle turned herself in at Fort Smith, was when Bass had the warrant for her arrest. Yeah, the burial place, that's a good question. There's a gentleman that found a book that showed where people were supposed to be buried in Muskogee County, and his Harding Memorial was the place listed as Bass's burial spot. That spot hasn't been found yet. He may be in Harding Memorial, which is behind, I guess, the Walmart store, and it was an old cemetery that had started after statehood, when blacks were not allowed to be buried in the regular cemetery. But I was also told by numerous people that Bass is buried at Peters Chapel Cemetery, which is on Fern Mountain Road between Muskogee and Tabb. I don't know until somebody actually find the tombstone and say, this is Bass's tombstone. But I know for a fact that people in Muskogee County had a habit of pulling up tombstones and putting them in their garages and such. So you may never find Bass's actual burial spot. But the bigger thing is, we know he lived, and we know what he accomplished, and we know that we can celebrate his life. And they have a statue in Fort Smith, Arkansas. It's a great statue. Muskogee is putting up a statue in January at where the Three Rivers Museum is located. If we never found him, Bass worked in disguise, right? That was his MO. So if he stayed in disguise, that's cool, because we know he was here. I mean, it's documented, so we know what he did. But if we can find his grave spot, that would be just, icing to the cake. More questions? All right. Thank you. Catherine says we're going to sign books, I believe.
Another round of applause for Art. I think he did a great job. He's one of my favorite historians. I've had a pleasure dragging him all over Cherokee Nation this past weekend, and so we've had a lot of fun visiting sites and stuff. So thank you all, and see you next time.